The airplane cabin buzzed with the usual pre-flight chaos, passengers settling in, overhead bins slamming shut, and the hum of muffled conversations blending with the soft, instrumental music playing over the intercom. Among the sea of well-dressed travelers, an elderly man hesitated at the entrance of the plane, gripping his worn-out duffel bag tightly. His clothes were simple, faded with time, and his shoes, though neatly polished, showed clear signs of age. The flight attendant stationed at the front of the cabin, a tall woman with sleek blonde hair and a sharp uniform, raised an eyebrow as the old man shuffled forward. Her name tag read Rebecca. She forced a tight-lipped smile, but couldn't hide the look of mild irritation in her eyes. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her tone professional, but noticeably less warm than the way she greeted the passengers before him. "May I see your boarding pass?" The old man, hands trembling slightly, fumbled in his jacket pocket before pulling out the crumpled ticket. Rebecca took one glance and sighed, barely concealing her distaste. 26B, she announced, a little too loudly, making sure those around her could hear. "That's all the way in the back, sir. Economy class." A few passengers near the entrance exchanged glances, smirking as they watched the interaction. Rebecca, without even offering to help, handed the ticket back with a dismissive nod. "Please move along quickly. We have other passengers boarding," she added, her voice dripping with impatience. The elderly man nodded humbly and began making his way down the narrow aisle. As he passed through the first-class section, he couldn't help but glance at the plush, spacious seats occupied by businessmen in expensive suits and women adorned with designer handbags. Some barely noticed him, engrossed in their tablets and champagne flutes. Others cast sideways glances, whispering amongst themselves. As he reached the economy section, a man in his 40s, wearing an expensive-looking wristwatch, chuckled and nudged his seatmate. "Did you see how that flight attendant looked at him? Like he didn't belong here," he snickered. His seatmate, a woman in a neatly pressed blazer, smirked. "Well, I mean, look at him. Probably hasn't flown in years, if ever." The old man heard their words, but said nothing. He simply bowed his head slightly and continued toward his seat. His frail fingers gripped the armrest as he slowly lowered himself down, letting out a quiet sigh as he settled in. Rebecca, now making her rounds through the aisle, stopped by his row. She placed her hands on her hips, her expression one of mild annoyance. "Sir, please make sure you fasten your seatbelt," she instructed, though she didn't offer to assist like she had with the other passengers. "Yes, ma'am," the old man replied politely, fumbling with the strap. Rebecca turned on her heel and walked away, shaking her head. As the airplane taxied down the runway, the cabin settled into a quiet hum. The old man, sitting in his cramped economy seat, gazed out the small oval window. He clutched his duffel bag on his lap, his fingers gently tracing the worn fabric, lost in thought. Across the aisle, the wealthy businessman who had mocked him earlier leaned back comfortably, stretching his legs. He glanced at the old man and let out a quiet chuckle. "Bet he's never flown before," he whispered to his seatmate. The woman beside him smirked. "Probably doesn't even know how to order a drink," she added, with a low laugh. Meanwhile, Rebecca, the flight attendant, strolled down the aisle, her polished heels clicking against the carpeted floor. She paused at the old man's row, her hands on her hips. "Would you like anything to drink, sir?" she asked, though her tone lacked the warmth she had used with the first-class passengers. The old man looked up and smiled politely. "Just some water, please?" Rebecca sighed and rolled her eyes slightly. "Of course," she muttered before walking away. Minutes later, she returned with a small plastic cup filled only halfway with water. She set it down with a slight thud on his tray table and moved on without another word. The businessman and his seatmate chuckled under their breath. "Wow, she didn't even give him a full cup," the man joked. The old man didn't react. He simply picked up the cup, his hands steady, and took a slow sip. Then, the moment everything changed. A deep, commanding voice spoke from the front of the cabin. "Excuse me, miss," the voice called out. Rebecca turned around, her expression shifting from boredom to surprise. A tall, well-dressed man with a confident posture was standing in the aisle. He had been sitting in first class the entire time, watching every interaction with quiet intensity. The man stepped forward. His dark, well-tailored suit and expensive watch made it clear that he was someone of importance. The murmurs in the cabin grew as passengers turned to see what was happening. "Yes, sir?" Rebecca asked, her voice suddenly sweeter, more accommodating. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked past her, directly at the old man. He took a deep breath and spoke loud enough for everyone in the cabin to hear. "Sir, I believe there's been a mistake," the man said, addressing the elderly passenger. The old man looked confused. "A mistake?" "Yes," the well-dressed man said. "You're sitting in the wrong seat." Gas rippled through the economy cabin. Rebecca blinked in confusion. I don't understand," she stammered. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a first-class boarding pass. He held it up for everyone to see. "This is my seat," he said, pointing to the seat where the old man was sitting. "And I believe yours is up front, sir." The cabin went silent. The businessman who had been mocking the old man stiffened in his seat. Rebecca's eyes widened. "Wait, what?" The well-dressed man turned back to the old man. "Please, come with me. First class is where you belong." The old man's eyes widened with surprise. "Oh, no, sir, I couldn't possibly—" "I insist," the man interrupted with a warm smile. The entire cabin was watching. Passengers craned their necks, eager to see what would happen next. Rebecca's face burned red. She looked between the old man and the well-dressed stranger, clearly flustered. Finally, the old man nodded slowly, standing up with quiet dignity. The man in the suit gently guided him toward the front of the plane, where the plush, first-class seats awaited. As the two men walked past, the businessman who had mocked the old man earlier shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His smirk was gone, replaced by an expression of embarrassment. Rebecca swallowed hard, suddenly realizing that everyone had witnessed her behavior. When the old man took his new first-class seat, the well-dressed man sat beside him and smiled. "Sir, I think you've earned a comfortable flight," he said. The old man blinked back tears. "But why? Why would you do this for me?" The man smiled. "Because respect should never be determined by wealth or appearances," he said. "Everyone deserves to be treated with kindness." The entire plane was silent. Even Rebecca, standing near the first-class section, looked humbled. But the lesson wasn't over yet. The flight continued smoothly as passengers settled into their seats. In first class, the old man sat uncomfortably, still looking around as if he didn't belong there. His hands trembled slightly as he sipped the water offered to him by a kind flight attendant who had taken over after Rebecca's rude behavior. Meanwhile, Rebecca stood at the back of the plane, her stomach twisting into knots. She felt a deep sense of unease. It wasn't just guilt, it was something more. The way the man had looked at her before walking away haunted her. There was a quiet dignity in his eyes, one that made her feel small, shallow. Suddenly, a voice came through the intercom. It was the pilot. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are approaching some light turbulence, so please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. We should be clear in a few minutes." "Thank you." Rebecca let out a breath, trying to shake off her unease. But then, just as she turned to check on the other passengers, she noticed something strange. The pilot had stepped out of the cockpit, something they rarely did mid-flight. She watched as the captain, a tall man in his early 50s with graying hair, walked directly toward the first-class section. His gaze was locked onto the old man sitting there. Then, to Rebecca's utter shock, his voice cracked as he spoke. "Dad?" A stunned silence fell over the cabin. The old man looked up, his eyes widening. He blinked a few times as if unsure he had heard correctly. "Son?" His voice came out barely above a whisper. The pilot quickly knelt beside the old man, grasping his hands. "Dad, what are you doing here? Why didn't you tell me you were flying today?" The old man smiled weakly. "Didn't want to bother you, son. Just wanted to see you." Passengers around them gasped, whispering amongst themselves. Rebecca felt her heart plummet to her stomach. The man she had dismissed, humiliated, and mocked, was the father of the pilot. The captain turned toward Rebecca, his expression unreadable, but his voice was calm, too calm. "Is there a reason my father wasn't treated with respect on this flight?" Rebecca's mouth went dry. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Heat burned in her cheeks as passengers stared at her, waiting for an answer. The old man patted his son's hand. "It's all right, son. Some people just don't see beyond what's in front of them." The captain exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "No, Dad. It's not all right." He turned back to Rebecca, his voice firm but not angry. "You judged a man by his appearance. Did you even think for a second about who he might be? What kind of life he's lived?" Rebecca felt her hands shake. She wanted to disappear, to rewind time and undo her actions. Passengers murmured in agreement. Some looked disappointed, others disgusted. A few even shook their heads at her. Then the businessman from earlier, the one who had also laughed at the old man, spoke up. "Captain, I think I owe your father an apology, too. I was disrespectful." He turned toward the old man. "Sir, I'm sorry for what I said earlier." The old man smiled, nodding. It's never too late to change. Rebecca, unable to hold back tears, whispered, "I'm so sorry. I was wrong." The captain helped his father adjust his seatbelt and gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. Then, before returning to the cockpit, he turned to Rebecca one last time. "Let this be a lesson," he said. "Kindness costs nothing, but disrespect, that can cost you everything." The flight continued in silence, but the atmosphere had changed. Passengers reflected on what had just happened. And Rebecca, she knew this was a moment that would stay with her forever. Karma had taught its lesson loud and clear. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.